We begin with Crimea, where it was yet another day of political twists and turns. The Ukrainian military said an officer was killed during an attack on their base in the Crimean capital Simferopol. It is the first attack since pro-Russian forces seized control in February. Ukraine has authorized its troops to retaliate in self-defense. The incident came shortly after Russian President Vladimir Putin and leaders of Crimea signed the Treaty of Accession to officially absorb the peninsula. The city of Sevastopol also entered the Russian Federation as a separate entity. Ukraine's interim government said the situation has changed to a military conflict. Meanwhile, the Western powers are calling for a G7 and European Union meeting next week. We have team coverage for you. We begin in the Russian capital, Moscow, where CCTV's Natalie Feary is standing by. Natalie.
Well, Elaine, President Vladimir Putin was certainly very poised, composed when he gave that address to the Russian parliament. He said the referendum in Crimea was legal and convincing. This, of course, despite all that condemnation from the EU and the US and those sanctions that have been imposed.
Президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Putin.
Vladimir Putin shows no signs of bowing to international pressure over Crimea. Quite the opposite. The president has his parliament behind him as he moves to incorporate the region, a region he says has always been Russian.
In order to understand the choice of the Crimean people, it is sufficient to know the history of Crimea, to know what Russia meant and means for them, and vice versa. In Crimea, virtually everything is permeated with our history and pride.
He told an audience of Russian lawmakers and pro-Russia leaders from Crimea that the region's referendum should be respected.
On the 16th of March, a referendum in Crimea was held according to all democratic norms and international laws. More than 96% decided to reunite with Russia.
The treaty signed in Moscow to move Crimea into the Russian Federation needs to be endorsed by Russia's constitutional court and ratified by parliament, but those steps should be formalities. What comes after is harder to predict.
I would not rule out anything at this point. The crisis is not over. With Putin's speech today, the crisis is not over. And this is absolutely not in the style of President Putin to unveil his plans.
In Moscow, President Putin's moves have led to public displays of support.
Today we witnessed history, and Crimea didn't just join Russia, it returned to its historic place where it's supposed to be.
We wanted to come to this meeting to show our solidarity to the people and support our president, who expressed the will of the Russian people.
And President Putin seems happy to ignore the threat of further sanctions.
Well, that's right. He doesn't really seem that worried given his response. And people here in Russia are surprised by how quickly this has happened. President Putin said that he'd recognized Crimea as an independent state, so people thinking that there might be a pause in the proceedings. But it now looks like this is going to go through very quickly, going to the parliament, no opposition expected there. And it looks like it could be signed into law within a matter of days.
And Natalie, what did Putin have to say about the West? Any word on the sanctions?
Well, no word really on the sanctions in his address, people taking this as a sign that he didn't really see them as very important or having much impact. He did refer to the West. He said the West acted irresponsibly in response to Ukraine, referring to a recognition of the government in Kiev, which he continues to say is illegitimate.
All right, CCTV's Natalie Feary live in Moscow.